The conflict in Ukraine is altering the global order, and in doing so, it has cast a harsh light upon Russia's ultra-wealthy elite, the oligarchs. Their penchant for extravagance is famous, manifesting in enormous yachts, opulent homes, and even personal football teams, a lifestyle defined by truffles, caviar, and champagne. Today, however, a number of them are facing repercussions as the Western world imposes penalties. In alliance with European partners, we are locating and confiscating their yachts, their lavish residences, and their private aircraft. The reason for this lies in the decisions of one individual, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Putin's own finances have come under intense scrutiny, prompting questions about his personal fortune. Could Vladimir Putin be the wealthiest individual? On the planet, it's believed that Putin must be the most affluent of them all, the ultimate oligarch and billionaire, against whom all others are measured. According to official Kremlin sources, President Putin receives a comparatively humble income of $140,000 annually. However, reports featuring stunning drone photography have asserted that he owns a vast $1 billion palace, in addition to private jets and massive yachts. The notion that their leader could be the wealthiest person in the world appeals to many Russians. Putin solidifies his authority in Russia using intimidation. In 2003, he orchestrated the arrest and imprisonment of the nation's richest man, graphically, illustrating the consequences for those who would dare to challenge him. He makes it clear they will face incarceration and ultimately be forced into exile. Now, with conflict blazing in Ukraine, he coolly insists on the oligarchs' allegiance, delivering his threats on national television. The oligarchs find themselves in a precarious position, trapped between condemnation from the West and potential retribution at home. This is the narrative of Russia's super-rich and the leader who holds dominion over them. Putin ascended to power in the year 2000, following President Boris Yeltsin's endorsement of him as his heir. The oligarchs also lent their support to Putin. Some of these powerful figures perceived him as a forward-looking, possibly even progressive and moderate politician. They saw him as someone they might be able to guide, much as they had with President Yeltsin. However, a significant shock awaited them. It became abundantly clear within the first couple of years of Putin's tenure that the oligarchs had backed a presidential candidate they had gravely misjudged. President Putin himself intended to be the true authority, the man and the regime firmly in command. Putin initiated a campaign to rein in the oligarchs, systematically outplaying the old guard figures like Boris Berezovsky and others from Yeltsin's inner circle. These men believed they could control Putin, only to discover with startling speed that this was not the case. Berezovsky and Putin experienced a major falling out, leading Berezovsky to depart the country in 2000. Yet another oligarch, who had amassed his wealth prior to Putin's presidency, has managed to stay in the leader's favor. Roman Abramovich is most famously recognized for his purchase of the Chelsea Football Club. He built his wealth through the Russian oil corporation, Sibneft, and holds shares in the steel behemoth Evraz, Norilsk Nickel, and the nation's biggest aluminum producer. In 2005, Abramovich divested his shares in the oil company for a sum exceeding $13 billion. Berezovsky later filed a lawsuit against Abramovich for breach of contract, which became the largest civil action in UK legal history. He asserted that he and Abramovich had jointly owned a share in Sibneft at the High Court in London. The Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich defended himself against claims that he had double-crossed a business associate. The accusation came from Boris Berezovsky, who maintained that he was effectively coerced into selling his oil shares for a mere portion of their actual value. In legal statements, Abramovich declared, "I was not his protege. He was not my mentor." He added, "I was quite surprised by his extravagant lifestyle. However, I was never interested in imitating this lifestyle." The court sided with Abramovich, with the judge concluding that Berezovsky had never held ownership. The verdict left Berezovsky on the verge of financial ruin. "Sometimes I had impression that Putin himself wrote this judgment," Berezovsky lamented. "Sometimes I had this impression." Less than a year following the verdict, Berezovsky was discovered deceased at his country estate, a ligature tied around his neck. The coroner recorded an open verdict. Abramovich, meanwhile, was at liberty to spend his fortune on exceptionally lavish items. His yacht, the Eclipse, is valued at an impressive $500 million and requires an estimated €1 million for a single refueling. It is equipped with 2 helicopter pads, a pair of swimming pools, numerous hot tubs, a personal mini-submarine, and a missile defense system. Following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Abramovich's future has become precarious. The UK has put a freeze on some of his assets, among them his cherished Chelsea football club. It is yet to be determined if Abramovich will manage to retain his billions. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution gave rise to the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state, which endured for the majority of the 20th century. Adhering to Marxist economic principles, Soviet rulers from Lenin onward prohibited private property. Russia began as a nation where the state possessed all the wealth. The chill of the Cold War started to recede in 1985, when Yeltsin's forerunner, Mikhail Gorbachev, formed a friendship with U.S. President Ronald Reagan. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Soviet Union rapidly transitioned toward the modern age. This initial exposure to capitalism sparked a wave of entrepreneurial activity. People would fill their vehicles with goods, travel to China, and return to sell items for 10 or even 100 times the purchase price. Russians began to aspire to a more affluent way of life. In December 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated. The process started in the Baltic nations and quickly spread to the Eastern European republics, including places like Ukraine and Moldova. Every single republic declared its sovereignty. The Soviet Union was no more. The collapse of the Soviet Union created fresh challenges. Gorbachev lost popular support, and Boris Yeltsin emerged as the new head of an independent Russia. He, however, took charge of a country in a desperate situation. It was financially ruined, with scant food available in shops. The banking system was on the verge of failure, and the economy had been brought to its knees. Consequently, President Yeltsin and his administration were in urgent need of funds. He appealed to the West for assistance. American consultants advised, what you need is to sell everything off. Privatize everything, move to a free market economy, and that's the way forward. Yeltsin distributed vouchers to the entire Russian populace, putting 150 million vouchers into circulation. These vouchers were intended as a means to buy shares in formerly state-owned enterprises, but only a select few understood their real worth. Many individuals were unsure what to do with these vouchers. They were compelled to sell them due to extreme poverty, and shrewd individuals acquired large quantities of these vouchers, enabling them to seize control of state assets. The voucher program failed to address the pressing need to cover wages and pensions. Yeltsin required immediate cash. One individual proposed a plan. Vladimir Putin was Russia's wealthiest man in March 2022 and is credited as the originator of a program known as loans for shares. This financial strategy marked the genesis of the oligarchy. He was truly the architect, the mastermind behind Russia's privatization initiatives in the 1990s, earning him the title of the Uber. The program operated by having well-connected individuals lend money to the Kremlin. If the government failed to repay the loan, the lenders would be compensated with shares in the nation's key industries. Putin established Interos Bank and built his fortune by taking over Norilsk Nickel, a company that was near financial ruin under the communist system, but soon proved to have immense commercial potential. His considerable financial power and sway even secured him a position within the Yeltsin administration. In 1996, Putin was appointed deputy prime minister. As for Putin's other critics, both Browder and Khodorkovsky sought refuge in London. The city also emerged as a prime location for oligarchs. The influx of Russian wealth into London gave a significant boost to the economy. Russians are known for their substantial spending. When the Russian oligarchs relocated to London, one of their first moves was to acquire property as a secure base. Their preferred districts were places like Knightsbridge, especially for its proximity to Harrods. If they have properties within the heart of the British establishment, which is Mayfair, Belgravia, Kensington, Chelsea, and those areas, they feel accepted. There have been several unexplained deaths of Russians in London. Alexander Litvinenko was a former KGB operative who obtained British citizenship in 2006. He was a past member of the security services who had, in effect, defected to the West. In 1998, He alleged that the KGB was responsible for the assassination of Boris Berezovsky and the murder of a journalist. On November 1, 2006, Litvinenko consumed poisoned tea at the Millennium Hotel in London's Mayfair. He became known as the man who solved his own murder after he deduced he had been poisoned. The event escalated into a diplomatic crisis. Putin wanted to make an example out of him, but he also wanted to test the British system of justice, and he discovered that there really is not a very robust system of justice. Putin has consistently denied any state involvement in assassinations. Some oligarchs have attempted to gain influence within the American political sphere. Oleg Deripaska amassed his wealth in the metals industry. He was primarily brought up by his grandparents. My grandmother, she was always, careful with the light. There was no light in the house, he recalled. He began dealing in metals during the chaotic period of the Soviet Union's collapse, when lawlessness was rampant. The aluminum sector offered the promise of huge returns, and violence ensued. Criminal gangs fought for dominance over the industry, resulting in the murder of around 100 people. Though there is no indication that Deripaska was personally involved in any criminal acts. He did, however, emerge in a position of control after the conflicts settled. Deripaska managed to come out ahead from what was a truly brutal period in the 1990s, an era dubbed the Aluminum Wars. He has asserted in the past that he brought stability to the industry. It was like a Wild West in Russia. It's not a period he remembers with pride. To go through without any single thing which you could later believe in was wrong it was very difficult. But I believe whatever I did, I can't sense that I'm proud, but I believe, I did right thing. Deripaska married into Yeltsin's inner circle and adapted swiftly to the new reality under Putin. The Kremlin had asserted its authority over law enforcement, and most entrepreneurs retained ownership of their companies only by the Kremlin's leave. Deripaska succeeded in preserving a functional relationship with Putin. The oligarchs are now going to be subservient to the state itself, and this is a shift. This is a new dynamic. Putin demonstrated who was in charge on national television after Deripaska closed a local factory, leaving employees unpaid. Deripaska was summoned like a misbehaving schoolboy to sign a contract to restart his factory. Part of his strategy involved expanding into the United States, and in 2003, he retained former Senator Bob Dole to advocate for his interests. He was able to approach a prominent figure in the American Republican Party and proposed, "I would like to give you a slice of my newfound wealth in order to access your country." Dole accepted the offer, taking the money, and the doors to the United States were suddenly opened for Mr. Deripaska. He gained a reputation for hosting extravagant parties at Davos, successfully cultivating an image of himself as a member of the international elite. Deripaska established a global footprint, forming the N+ Group in 2006, and his aluminum company grew to be the largest in the world. Deripaska became a major news figure during the Mueller investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. He had a close relationship with Paul Manafort, the former chief of staff for the Trump campaign. The inquiry into supposed connections between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia took a significant turn when it was revealed that his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, had been indicted by a federal grand jury. Manafort was given a 7-year prison sentence. His convictions covered tax fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and lobbying without registration. A year later, he received a pardon from President Trump. The U.S. placed sanctions on N+ and confiscated some of Deripaska's assets in 2018. Oleg Deripaska refuted all the accusations made against him. He tried to restore his reputation by suing the U.S. Treasury. When questioned by reporters about the lawsuit, he said, "I know that I was punished only because I was Russian businessman. There was no other Russian explanation, and I hope to see what they will present in court when they need to present their answers." His legal action failed, but the U.S. Treasury under the Trump administration did remove the sanctions on N+. After Deripaska decreased his controlling stake in the company, and so Putin was really more of an image for Trump of something that he wanted to be himself, one analyst noted. He had degrees of autocrat envy, and he certainly saw Putin, on that surface, as being the richest of the rich, potentially the richest man in the world, running a country as if it was his own asset. And so he also saw him as being not just fabulously rich, but fabulously powerful. As for Deripaska, he has progressed significantly from being just an up-and-coming businessman with purported links to organized crime. In 2021, Deripaska faced more legal issues in the U.S. when the FBI conducted searches of his residences in New York and Washington, D.C. Then, after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the UK enacted additional sanctions on Deripaska, freezing his assets there as well. What we've concluded is that there is enough connection, enough of a link between the Putin regime and the individuals in question to justify the action. I can see that people connected to the Putin regime need to be sanctioned, and that's what we're doing. As a result of Putin's military campaign in Ukraine, some oligarchs have had their superyachts, private aircraft, and grand residences confiscated by Western European nations and the United States. In February 2022, the U.S. government unveiled a new klepto-captured task force to uphold these sanctions. We will leave no stone unturned in our efforts to investigate, arrest, and prosecute those whose criminal acts enable the Russian government to continue this unjust war. One of the most devoted members of the new oligarch class comes from Putin's native St. Petersburg. Yevgeny Prigozhin is said to have accumulated his wealth from substantial catering agreements with the Kremlin. Of the most recent oligarchs, those who are closest to Putin, Mr. Prigozhin is probably the most interesting, perhaps the most obvious candidate for scrutiny. By all measures, Prigozhin is a remarkably capable individual. He is also considered an exceptionally skilled chef. In fact, he is famously known as Putin's chef. He served a prison sentence for robbery, fraud, and involving minors in criminal activities. Upon his release, he started as a hot dog seller before transitioning into the restaurant industry. Putin frequented his establishments, and Prigozhin became a trusted associate. He secured major contracts for providing food to Russia's schools and armed forces, and also managed catering for state functions. In 2002, President George W. Bush was one of his guests, with Prigozhin consistently at Putin's side. But as a handful of individuals thrived, a great number of ordinary Russians suffered. The overwhelming majority of the Russian population was thoroughly cheated, and the new free market system failed to produce positive results for them. In Russia, experienced literal starvation. University professors were forced to work as taxi drivers, and nurses had to turn to prostitution. As a result, there was not a single happy person in Russia by the conclusion of the Yeltsin period. Yeltsin had been well liked by the populace, but a string of discomfiting televised events eroded confidence in his leadership. By 1999, his time was up, as alcoholism took a heavy toll and his health declined. The next year, Vladimir Putin assumed the presidency of Russia, heralding a new chapter for the oligarchs. Born in St. Petersburg in 1952, Putin entered the Russian security services, the KGB, at the age of 23 and quickly ascended through its hierarchy. From his early days in the KGB as a young man in the 1970s, in what was then Leningrad, he was evidently skilled at concealing personal information. He was chosen as a possible successor to Yeltsin and became part of the administration in 1996. He grew into a favored candidate for the leadership role. The general public saw him as a decisive leader, a man of faith, and someone who would eradicate corruption. He was seen as this bare-chested bear of a man who was prepared to take actions that his effeminate Western counterparts were not. The oligarchs backed his ascent, anticipating he would be a progressive figure like Yeltsin. Yet Putin had no desire to let the oligarchs wield influence over his presidency. Yeltsin had been ensnared by the schemes of the various oligarchs surrounding him, a situation Putin was determined to avoid. Putin felt he had to be the most affluent of them all, the ultimate oligarch and billionaire against whom all others were measured. He cultivated public support by portraying himself as a charismatic man of action riding with motorcycle gangs, flying alongside cranes, spearfishing, and showing affection to animals and children. He captured the public's favor, but his most effective maneuver was re-establishing authority. His tool of choice was fear. He started with a dramatic move by targeting the most renowned oligarch in all of Russia. In 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky held the title of Russia's wealthiest man, his wealth derived from oil. With a background in chemistry, Khodorkovsky possessed a talent for launching innovative new ventures. He was a highly intelligent individual from a technical background and very much an independent mind, but he was significantly ahead of his era. In 1988, he founded one of the nation's pioneering private banks. He extended a loan to the government and hit the jackpot when the government could not repay it, resulting in him gaining a 78% share in the state-owned Yukos oil company. The company became exceedingly profitable and lucrative, generating billions of dollars. He then did something rather unexpected for a Russian oligarch. Over time, he aimed to reshape it into a Western-style corporation, managing it as a for-profit enterprise rather than a source of endless cash, potentially tied to Kremlin insiders. He subsequently allocated some of his earnings to support opposition parties, an act the Kremlin considered unacceptable. He was perceived as a possible competitor to Putin, who was then convinced that Khodorkovsky needed to be brought down. The chance arose when Khodorkovsky publicly challenged Putin on television regarding state-level corruption. This confrontation would become a historic turning point. Putin launched a subtle but potent response, leveling accusations of tax evasion against him. Then, on October 25, 2003, Khodorkovsky's world was turned upside down. He was aboard his private jet when it landed on an airstrip and was immediately swarmed by agents of the Federal Security Service. They took Khodorkovsky into custody. Russia, being put on trial, means facing a 99.7% conviction rate in criminal cases. Putin then permitted television crews into the courtroom to capture footage of Russia's wealthiest man confined to a cage. This broadcast had a profound impact on all the other oligarchs. Imagine that you're on your yacht. You're parked off in Antibes, France. Flick on CNN. And there, you see a guy far smarter, far more powerful, far richer than you, sitting in a cage. What's the natural reaction? You don't want to sit in that cage for yourself. Khodorkovsky was convicted of fraud and imprisoned. He spent a full decade in a penal colony, serving as a stark warning to other oligarchs about the boundaries of their ownership and commercial freedom. Khodorkovsky was finally freed in 2013, flown to Berlin, and later relocated to London. He is now one of Putin's most vocal detractors. You have to understand we're dealing with a criminal group in power and not a state of law, he states. This group is power rests on force. Bill Browder understands the experience of being on the unfavorable side of Vladimir Putin. He was among the first foreign investors in Russia's fledgling stock market. In 2005, he was expelled from the country and his assets were confiscated. He provided testimony concerning the repercussions of Khodorkovsky's trial before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. Other oligarchs went to Vladimir Putin and said, "What do we have to do to not sit in the cage?" And he said very straightforward, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin, and so he became the richest man in the world in that moment. In reaction to these statements, other oligarchs from that period have vehemently refuted Browder's allegations. Investigative journalists have attempted to uncover the full extent of Putin's wealth, but the most successful individual in this endeavor has been Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. This is the reason he is imprisoned and why there was an attempt on his life using Novichok, the same substance, albeit in a different form, that was used to poison Sergei and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury. Novichok is a lethal nerve agent, a chemical weapon. This was a grave attempt to silence Navalny, because he has been remarkably adept at exposing and tracing the many threads of corruption and kleptocracy that envelop Putin. Attack. But upon his return to Russia, he was incarcerated for violating bail conditions while he was abroad receiving life-saving medical care. He came back to Moscow fully aware that he would be arrested. He then circulated a video which he had invested considerable time in creating, detailing the ownership trails that he and his team had traced to a massive, opulent, and lavish villa on the Russian Black Sea. This was not merely a palace. It made Versailles look modest. Navalny's team managed to get around a no-fly zone by using a drone to film Putin's palace in all its splendor. The estate is said to be valued at over $1 billion and is filled with extravagant amenities. It isn't country house or a residence, it's an entire city, or rather, a kingdom. Among its numerous amenities, a large green hill on the property is believed to conceal an underground ice hockey rink. Navalny frequently ridiculed Putin for his lack of refinement, pointing out a horrible pole dancing room and an aqua disco as examples of really in poor taste. Putin disavowed any connection to the palace, and another Russian billionaire subsequently stepped forward to claim ownership. In March 2022, as bombs fell on Ukraine, Navalny received an additional 9 prison sentence. It remains uncertain if this was connected to Navalny's assertions that a particular superyacht, the Shahrazada, also belongs to Putin. Media reports estimated the yacht's value at $700 million, ranking it among the world's priciest super. The British captain of the vessel denied that the boat is owned by Putin. Whether Prigozhin's responsibilities were strictly culinary is somewhat ambiguous. History would later reveal him being accused of concocting entirely different kinds of schemes for the Kremlin. He begins moving into a new space entirely, the social media space. Prigozhin was charged with trying to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election through the creation of an entity called the Internet Research Agency. He was someone who could anticipate the power and effect of social media itself. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted 13 Russian nationals associated with this research agency. The accused allegedly waged what they termed information warfare against the United States. 12 of the individual defendants worked at various times for a company called Internet Research Agency, LLC, a Russian company based in St. Petersburg. Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin funded the conspiracy. U.S. intelligence characterized the agency as a troll farm. It utilized fabricated accounts, or bots, on prominent social media platforms. These were Russian trolls sitting at keyboards. In St. Petersburg, targeting American tensions to sow chaos across the board, they employed misappropriated or fake American identities, fraudulent bank accounts, and counterfeit identification papers. The indictment stated that the Americans involved were unaware they were interacting with Russians. Much of the effort involved amplifying the really hot-button topics and the divisions and cleavages that have emerged. For example, gun rights, abortion, religious identity. Prigozhin denied any involvement in the 2016 election, stating, "If they want to see the devil, let them." Then, in 2020, U.S. intelligence declared that Prigozhin was thought to be the force behind a private military organization called Wagner. He has been connected to all number of other extraterritorial Kremlin interests. The Wagner Group has been heavily involved in operations overseas for Russia, where the Russians don't want to risk conventional military forces. Military experts suggest that Wagner provides Putin with plausible deniability. Prigozhin was sanctioned by both the EU and the UK for purported ties to Wagner's operations. The EU leveled accusations against Wagner for grave human rights violations, including torture. In 2021, the FBI put out a $250,000 reward for information that would lead to Prigozhin's arrest. He has been identified by the highest levels of the American government, one of the most successful players in Russian efforts at destabilizing Western countries, including the United States of America. Prigozhin has consistently denied any association with Wagner's activities or any form of misconduct. In recent years, intelligence agencies have increasingly turned their attention to Vladimir Putin, as have journalists. In early 2016, a global consortium of hundreds of journalists gained an unparalleled view into the clandestine world of offshore finance. This investigation became known as the Panama Papers. At its core was a massive data leak from a company named Mossack Fonseca. It was a law firm and an offshore services provider, located, as its name implies, in Panama, offering offshore structures and anonymous wealth management to clients worldwide. In 2018, Mossack Fonseca announced its closure, citing the reputational harm from the Panama Papers leak while denying any illicit activities. In 2020, prosecutors obtained arrest warrants for its partners on charges of being accessories to tax evasion and forming a criminal enterprise. However, one particular individual who surfaced in the Panama Papers caused many to take notice. He was not a particularly prominent figure, neither for his political connections nor for his wealth. Instead, he was recognized for his musical abilities. Sergei Roldygin is a professional cellist and the artistic director of the St. Petersburg House of Music. It is widely known that he is a close personal friend of Vladimir Putin. Roldygin was one of the individuals revealed in the Panama Papers to be secretly managing an astonishing portfolio of assets through these offshore, anonymous, financial entities. The documents exposed a $2 billion offshore network connected to Roldugan, leading some to suspect there was more to the story. Putin asserted that the funds were used for acquiring expensive musical instruments. Roldugan maintains that any fortune associated with him came from donations by businessmen to purchase instruments for young Russian musicians. Putin's personal wealth has long been a topic of conjecture, as has his dynamic with the oligarchs. But as their combined fortunes see billions erased due to Putin's devastating war, that relationship is undergoing its most severe trial. It's possible the oligarchs were the target of his comments in a furious speech. So I think Putin does see himself as a czar in many respects. He sees himself as a historic figure, carrying on at least the legacy of the czars. The oligarchs' capacity to play both sides, reaping the benefits of both East and West, has come to an end. As a Russian proverb says, one cannot escape one's destiny. There are never happy endings to Russian stories, and there's not going to be happy endings for most of the Russian oligarchs. It's a terrible dog-eat-dog world to get where they got. And it's kind of hard to see happy endings for most of these people.